Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Chapter 21, Part 2. We're going to pick up with the road to war right where we left off at the end of Part 1. And when we get to the beginning of World War I, European nations had begun to develop alliances, and these alliances were going to create tension due to the result of various other events, and we'll talk about those as we go through as well. The major powers of Europe were organized as follows. We have the Allied powers of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central powers of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And it's important to note that there wasn't specifically that we would say they were the Allied or Central powers prior to the beginning of the war, but essentially what they're called is the Triple Entente, which linked Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, which connected the other three. And essentially what happens here, on June 28th of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. Okay, and we're going to talk about the cause of World War I here in a second. But he was to be the heir to the throne of the empire there in Austria-Hungary. He was assassinated while paying a visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, then a province of Austria-Hungary, and Slavic nations wished to annex Bosnia to neighboring Serbia. The killer of the Archduke and his wife Sophie was a Serbian nationalist. Now, what happens here is as a result of an alliance that Serbia had with Russia, you have Russia coming to the aid of Serbia, and you have Germany coming to the aid of Austria-Hungary. Okay, and your book talked about it right here. The Germans, faced with the provocation against their ally and concerned about a two-war front against Russia and France, declared war against both. Germany's subsequent assault on France ran through neutral Belgium, prompting Britain to declare war on Germany. So essentially, it's kind of like this. It's imagine a fist fight, and your friend's friend gets in a fight. Your friend gets involved in the fight, and so you have to get in the fight because your friend got involved in his friend's fight. That's essentially how this war became a world war instead of being just a simple skirmish between nations. On the one side were the Central Powers, as we talked about, joined in the fall by the Ottoman Empire, and on the other side were the Allies made up of Britain, France, and Russia. Hoping to seize territory from the Central Powers, Italy and Japan soon threw in their lot with the Allies. As these changes suggest, the alliance system did not necessarily bind nations to act as they did, but leaders made the decisions for war based on their own interests and ambitions, and that national self-defense required it. So you have four reasons why the First World War started. I always get my words messed up because some people call it World War I. A lot of people call it the First World War. Anyways, doesn't matter how you call it. It's still the same. There's four causes, and we want to think of those as the main causes of World War I. All right, first off was militarism. Okay, and militarism has to do with the influence of military power, the building up of arms, etc. And at the beginning of this kind of conflict, we're going to see a lot of nations building up their armaments and weapons and the overall military strength. More specifically, most of these nations had this paranoia that their neighbor was going to build up a bigger military than them, which was going to lead to them being left vulnerable to an attack. But you also had that on both sides. It wasn't just the Central Powers or the Allied powers. The British had an obsession with naval dominance, and they were in almost kind of like a naval race with Germany. The second part here, alliances, that's pretty self-explanatory, but you essentially had two camps created between around about 1870 to 1914, the Triple Alliance, as I mentioned, and the Triple Entente, and essentially, that's going to lead to what starts to the war more so than I feel like any other point. Imperialism is another part. This pushed countries towards adopting this alliance. Colonies were these units of exchange that could be bargained without significantly affecting, any specific kind of status quo. But they also brought nations who would otherwise not interact into kind of a conflict and an agreement. Perfect example is the Russo-Japanese War that involved China that we already talked about. It brought them into the Triple Entente. Okay, it brought them to being involved with France and Britain and Russia. It's also been suggested that Germany was motivated by imperial ambitions to invade Belgium and France, and certainly their expansion of the British and French empires, fired by the rise of industrialism and pursuit of new markets, caused some resentment in Germany. Okay, so you've got a lot of issues here going on over in Europe. And then finally, nationalism was also a new and powerful source of tension in Europe, which was tied to militarism, all right, and this idea that, you support your nation, have this sense of nationalism that is surrounded by the rise of your military. Okay, the assassination, however, of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was by far the most significant trigger of the war, because once he's assassinated, it throws the others into war. Now, Wilson was very big on neutrality, and we're going to get off that slide and move a little bit quicker. Took too long. He wanted to keep the United States out of war, but the U.S. was going to trade significantly with Britain and France, and he did not want to ruin that. You also had this issue that's going to kind of push the United States more towards being a member with Great Britain and France and Russia of the Triple Entente, and that is because Germany begins the unrestricted warfare with their submarines of attacking essentially any ships that they want, and they sank any enemy ships or anything that they felt like was an enemy ship. More specifically, they sank the Lusitania, which had 128 Americans on board, even though the Americans were warned prior to the sinking of the Lusitania that they were going to sink any ship suspected of having cargo aiding their enemies. Germany still sank it. Also, the Sussex, which was a French ship which sank by Germany, leads to the Sussex Pledge, where Germany pledged not to sink ships without a warning first. Okay, so, eventually what happens is Germany, fearful that America is going to get involved, begins to try to backpedal and begin to, say, okay, maybe, we were a little too hostile. Maybe we should try to be a little more fair because, y'all have not picked a side and you are remaining neutral. Then when we get to the election of 1916, Woodrow Wilson has kept us out of the war to this point, and that's what the campaign he runs on. The problem is right around this same time, Mexico receives a telegram, which we intercept, known as the Zimmerman telegram, which urged Mexico to attack the United States and that Mexico would get the land back from the United States that it lost during the Mexican-American War. The note, along with Germany reinstituting unrestricted submarine warfare, brought the U.S. into the war. So essentially, Germany pledges it's not going to do anything, then essentially turns right around. On April 2nd of 1917, Wilson asked for the declaration of war, and the United States is involved. So, we're going to get into preparedness as well, and I want to make sure we cover that because your notes kind of skip it just a little bit, but your book does not. During the president's increasing bellicosity in 1916, he was still far from ready to commit to the war. One obstacle was American politics. The question of whether America should make military and economic preparations for war sparked a heated debate. Wilson at first denounced the idea of an American military buildup, as needles and provocative. In the fall of 1915, however, he endorsed an ambitious proposal by American military leaders. And you need to know this. This is something that's important. Still, the peace faction wielded considerable political strength. The convention became especially enthusiastic when the keynote speaker punctuated his list of president's diplomatic achievements with the chant, "What did we do? What did we do? We didn't go to war. We didn't go to war." Okay? During the war campaign, did nothing to discourage those who argued that Republican candidate, so on, could lead better. More specifically, though, the American preparedness movement is going to be important to America as we get ready to get involved in this war. Now, Russia withdrew in 1918, and they gave up a significant amount of land. More specifically, Germany actually paid Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin to go into Russia and to overthrow the Tsar, and Tsar Nicholas, I believe Tsar Nicholas II, is overthrown, and Lenin establishes a communist government, which then pulls Russia out of the war. That at least took one side of the war away from Germany. It's one of the reasons Germany financed it. Also, during this time, we have a national draft instituted. 3 million men are drafted, 2 million volunteer, creating a force of 5 million American males, headed into the Expeditionary Force. Women could enlist, although they would not be in combat, and 400,000 African Americans enlisted as well, hoping to improve their status. Unfortunately, many of these African Americans were left to dig trenches and to do menial tasks that were not put onto the front lines of battle. Now, there is a group that is known as the Harlem Hellfighters that were sent to France that did fight on the front lines, and one of the most well-known African American groups that fought in the war, and they were decorated by the French government. Trench warfare is going to ensue throughout the war. It's said that they dug enough trenches to cover the world a couple times, I want to say, but the trenches would have reached all the way around the world if they were connected end to end. And they dug these miles and miles of trenches, and in between these trenches laid no man's land, and that was the part you did not go. Poisonous gas was used, flamethrowers were used, and there was a high casualty rate in trenches, especially from influenza. And disease killed as many troops in this war probably as weapons did, just to the rat-infested, maggot-infested, I mean, just all sorts of things in these trenches, and it was filthy. Now, how was the war financed? First of all, America was going to use Liberty bonds, okay, and these Liberty bonds encouraged you to essentially invest in the war, which put a bullet into the gun, which I want to say the slogan from Captain America for World War II, which is a bullet in your best guy's gun. But more specifically, it was sending troops over there and trying to mobilize our military. And I want to take just a second before we move on. Your book goes into a lot more detail, and I like talking about some of these things. It talks about Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. Make sure you cover that in your reading. The Selective Service Act, which we talked about. Basic training as well. And then the Yanks are coming in the American Expeditionary Force. You talked about that little section in your book as well. Talk about John J. Pershing in the 1st American Expeditionary Force. And John J. Pershing, when he goes over in the first wave, realizes that America is going to need a lot of troops and it needs a lot of help in this war. Let's see. All right, goes into the technology. I want to skip through some of that. I don't care about that. Okay, Liberty bonds. Here's what I want to get to. Sorry, guys. I like to go through the book with you. By the time the war ended, the federal government had appropriated $32 billion for war, a staggering sum at the time. The entire federal budget had seldom exceeded $1 billion before 1915. And as recently as 1910, the nation's entire gross national product had been only $35 billion. To raise the money, the government relied on two devices. Liberty bonds to the public. By 1920, the sale of these bonds, accompanied by elaborate patriotic appeals, had produced $23 billion. At the same time, new taxes were bringing in the additional sum of nearly $10 billion. Some of it incoming from levies on excess profits, steeply graduated income, and inheritance taxes, and ultimately rose as high as 70% in some tax brackets. Okay, so these bonds essentially are, you give money to the government, they give you a bond or a sheet of paper that says that you've loaned it to the government. Then you can cash in these bonds with interest later on that essentially you make money off of giving the government your money. Now, talking about Herbert Hoover, okay, he was very important in helping us develop more than just volunteering and rationing for the war. He's also responsible for many other things following and after the war, and we'll get to that when we get to the Great Depression and some of the things that follows during this time. Let's see here. I want to make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, National War Labor Board forms, which resolved labor disputes. It was important to keep these unions from disputing against the war effort. And we talked about the IWW and the industrial workers of the world. We talked about them prior to this chapter. And nicknamed the I Won't Work Party, which said they sabotaged factories. Also the AFL, which was led by Samuel Gompers. The American Federation of Labor, which we also talked about, they favored the war. And membership actually increased as a result of them favoring the war. So, it's two schools of thought here, but the IWW tended to appear as they were sabotaging the war effort, and that did not go well. Okay, we also see the Great Migration, which was the mass movement of African Americans from the South to the industrial North. It was an opportunity for many African Americans to improve their status as war production increased and the overall industrial product was increasing in the North. Okay, and then in the summer of 1919, we see a red summer, quote unquote, where we saw race riots in the North, as well as, and we didn't get to talk about it, but the race riots in Wilmington going on in the earlier period of the 1900s is something to make sure that you know, to come back to, just in case. Maybe something that you already read, and if you did, great. But there's a lot of racial riots going on anyways in our country during this period of time. Not to the extent that it's just everywhere, but there is an issue of civil rights that is not being met, and it's going to lead to many Americans being upset, specifically in the African American community. Now, we have this, what's your book called, The Feudal Search for Social Unity. Okay, you had the Committee on Public Information, CPI, George Creel, who put out pro-war material, and we're going to talk about that for just a second. The most conspicuous official effort to support the war was a vast propaganda campaign by the Committee of Public Information. The CPI supervised the distribution of over 75 million pieces of printed material and controlled much of the information available for newspapers and magazines. Creel encouraged journalists to exercise self-censorship when reporting war news, and most complied by covering the war largely as the government wished. In 1918, government distributed posters and films offering lurid and exaggerated portrayals of the savagery of the Germans. In this climate, songwriters and other artists produced popular works that heavily favored the war. So what you see is a promotion of, trying to keep America in a good light to the American people, which would then increase the American war effort. You also saw the government begin to try to suppress this dissent. The passage of the Espionage Act of 1917, which many would say was, a influence from a former day. When we think about the Alien and Sedition Acts of a different time period, but specifically gave the government new tools to combat spying, sabotage, or obstruction of the war effort. The Sabotage Act and the Sedition Act both passed in 1918, expanding the meaning of the Espionage Act to make illegal any public expression of opposition to the war. In practice, they allowed officials to prosecute anyone who criticized the president or the government. Okay, the most frequent targets of this was the newly formed groups such as the Socialist Party and the IWW, and many Americans had favored the repression of socialists and radicals even before the war. And following the war, you're going to see the Red Scare, and we'll talk more about that as we go. Okay. So the Espionage Act, as I mentioned, prosecuted anti-war individuals. Eugene Debs, again one person, convicted and sentenced to 10 years for his involvement. And remember, he's involved in the Socialist Party and was an opponent to the war. A pardon by President Warren G. Harding ultimately won him his release in 1921. So he didn't have to serve that entire sentence. In all, more than 1,500 people were arrested in 1918 for the crime of criticizing the government. The decision was upheld by Schneck versus the United States. Okay, in the Supreme Court decision, it left the Espionage Act in place. And then the Sedition Act, as I mentioned, strengthened the Espionage Act, restricted free speech, and the ability to criticize the government. Remember the Alien and Sedition Acts. We already talked about that. Okay, and then immigrants were most often targeted, German Americans specifically. Performances of German music was frequently banned. German foods such as sauerkraut and bratwurst were renamed Liberty Cabbage and Liberty Sausage. German books were removed from library shelves. Courses in German language were dropped from school curricula. And Germans were routinely fired from jobs in war industries lest they sabotage important tasks. If you want to talk about the issue of America during World War I and World War II, this is it. Trying to figure out where do we actually stand with some of these immigrants who have come in our country. Are they Americans, or are they for us, or are they against us? Okay. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put these up here. Wilson's 14-point plan was a plan for the post-war world, which had self-determination, no alliance, and freedom of the seas, etc. Many of these points were trying to allow countries to choose for themselves what they would be, trying to allow for no alliances, which is what got us in the war, according to many, no German U-boats, and the creation of a League of Nations. The League of Nations would be a world organization committed to solving disputes. And the U.S. Senate did not like Article 10, which called for members to give assistance to others if needed, which would take away Congress's war-declaring powers and end isolation. Therefore, the United States never joined the League of Nations. Coupled with the fact that Woodrow Wilson gets sick and dies during the kind of like collaboration period, it hurt that as well. Now, you also have the Russian Civil War going on during this time, the Reds versus the Whites, and Wilson and the U.S. supported the Whites, okay, in this revolution, okay, and you had, let's see if I can find it in your text. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can find it here. All right, I thought your text went through, but I cannot seem to find it. So what I'll read you here is the two large combatant groups were the Red Army fighting for the Bolshevik form of socialism led by Vladimir Lenin. Okay, so that's the group that overthrew the Russian government and the Tsar. And then the loosely allied forces known as the White Army, which included diverse interests. Now, Wilson will not support or recognize the Soviet Union, and the United States as a whole will not recognize the Soviet Union, which is Vladimir Lenin's government, until 1933, which is interesting considering the fact that Russia ends up having to be a very vital ally during the war. All right, to ratify the treaty or not. Okay, your book went in the Paris Peace Conference, and I want to read you this because it was important to note that everyone had their own self-interest. You also had this thirst for revenge and fears of the unstable situation in Russia. Because of the tense and often vindictive atmosphere, Wilson was unable to win approval of many of his broad principles or to prevent other allies from imposing punitive reparations on Germany. And these reparations are going to be a direct effect into World War II because Germany's going to essentially be blamed for the war. And, then on top of that, after Germany's blamed for the war, it's going to lead to Germany owing a lot of people money. And we'll get to that more when we get into the Great Depression. But his most visible triumph, that being Wilson, and one most important to him was the creation of a permanent international organization, the League of Nations. Okay, Wilson presented the Treaty of Versailles, so named for the palace outside where the agreement was signed, to the Senate on July 10, 1919. But remember that chambers had many objections, specifically Henry Cabot Lodge, we'll talk about, okay, was against the treaty. He wrote the 14 reservations. And many detested Article 10, which I already talked about. And Wilson went on a speaking tour across the country talking about the irreconcilables. And essentially, they're going to follow his tour. And let's see if I can find that little section here as well. Wilson decided to appeal to the public and embarked on a grueling cross-country speaking tour to arouse public support. For more than 3 weeks, he traveled over 8,000 miles by train, speaking as often as 4 times a day. After speaking in Colorado on September 25, 1919, he collapsed with severe headaches. Canceling the rest of his itinerary, a few days later, he suffered a major stroke. For 2 weeks, he was close to death. For 6 weeks more, he was seriously ill that he virtually made no public appearances. And his wife and his doctor formed an almost impenetrable barrier around him, shielding the president from any official pressures that might impede his recovery. And it's one of the reasons for, I can't think of what amendment it is. I believe it's the 23rd Amendment. But it's the creation of the reason that we know exactly how the order of government is formed, and that's to make sure that if a president is incapacitated, we know how to fix it immediately. Because, let me see, incapacitation, there we go. It is the 25th Amendment, sorry. I wanted to look it up real quick. Because Woodrow Wilson's wife effectively ran the country while he was sick. You would think it would be the vice president, which is kind of what would happen today, but in this case, she was running the country. Wilson ultimately recovered enough to resume a limited official schedule, but he was essentially an invalid for the remaining 18 months of his presidency. When the Foreign Relations Committee finally sent the treaty to the Senate recommending nearly 50 amendments and reservations, Wilson refused to consider any of them, and the effort to win ratification failed. In the aftermath, Wilson became convinced that the 1920 national election would serve as a solemn referendum on the League. By now, however, public interest in the peace process began to fade as a series of other crises claimed their attention. Now, there was a post-war recession in 1919 to 1920. 1919, the year of the strike. Strikes were associated with radicalism. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge was critical of the strikes. African Americans did not gain rights after fighting either in the war. Banned from parades in Europe. The Red Summer, don't confuse this with communism, okay, led to race riots in 1919 in Chicago, and this is what I was talking about earlier. Many African Americans were upset of the issues of not being considered and not being a part of celebrations, as well as the economy struggling during this time. Black World War I veterans came home in 1919 and tried to march down the main streets of cities with other returning troops, and elsewhere the march, again, the streets of black neighborhoods such as Harlem, led by jazz bands, cheered by thousands of African Americans, believing that the glory of black heroism in the war would make it impossible for white society to ever again to treat African Americans as second class. As it turned out, in fact, it actually had no impact on white attitudes because many of the people that were still here did not understand the effects of the war. During the war, nearly 500,000 blacks had migrated from the rural South to industrial cities. This is the Great Migration that we talked about. And then we had the wartime riots in East St. Louis and elsewhere, where a prelude to a summer of much worse racial violence in 1919. A black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan on a hot July day happened to drift towards a white beach. Whites on shore allegedly stoned him unconscious. He sank and drowned. Angry African Americans gathered in crowds and marched into white neighborhoods to retaliate. Whites formed an even larger crowd and roamed into black neighborhoods. For more than a week, Chicago was virtually at war. In the end, 38 people had died, 15 whites and 23 blacks, and 537 were injured. Over 1,000 people were left homeless, and the Chicago riot was the worst, but not the only racial violence during the so-called Red Summer. In all, 120 people died in such racial outbreaks. The 1919 riots were different. In one respect, they did not just involve white people attacking blacks, but also blacks fighting back. The NAACP signaled this change by urging blacks not just to demand government protection, but also to defend themselves. Poet Claude McKay, one of the major figures of what would soon be known as the Harlem Renaissance, wrote a poem after the Chicago riot called it "If We Must Die." Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. The next figure is Marcus Garvey. And I'm going to bring his picture back up here for just a second. Marcus Garvey promoted black nationalism, also was responsible for creating the United Negro Improvement Association, which opened up a chain of African-American grocery stores. And I want to read that little section to you. And also pressed for the creation of other black businesses, and was also responsible for pushing the Back to Africa movement, which sought to try to push African-Americans to Africa. Okay, so bringing a contingency of African-American people who are discriminated against, moving them back to Africa and building a new society free of racism. Okay, now this gets into our next point with the Red Scare, and the Red Scare is something that you need to be very, very familiar with. It was a crusade led by Attorney General Mitchell Palmer against suspected communists, and this fear grows throughout America during the early 1920s into really all the way into World War II, but they would go against anyone who was a suspected communist. Over 1,000 Americans were arrested, 3 guns discovered in their raids, and the impact of the Red Scare is going to more importantly lead to businesses being able to break up unions, being able to essentially accuse anyone who they feel like is not in line with them as being a communist, and using it really as a scapegoat. Now, your book talks about here the combination of strikes and the Comintern announcement produced what became known as the Red Scare. Nearly 30 states enacted new peacetime sedition laws. So this goes right back to, if you're trying to compare something from another period to the Red Scare, the Alien Sedition Acts of the late 1700s, this would be a great example to compare that to. Nearly 30 states enacted these new sedition laws, imposed harsh penalties on promoters of revolution. Spontaneous acts of violence against supposed radicals occurred in some communities, and universities and other institutions tried to expel radicals from their midst. On New Year's Day, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and his ambitious young assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, that's important to note, orchestrated a series of raids on alleged radical centers throughout the country and arrested more than 6,000 people. Most of those arrested ultimately were released, but over 500 who were not American citizens were summarily deported. Later in 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street, killing 38 people. No one was ever convicted of this bombing. But the ferocity of the Red Scare gradually abated, but its effects lingered well into the 1920s. And that brings us to Seiko and Vanzetti. Two Italian immigrants, anarchists, atheists, draft dodgers charged with murder, found guilty, and executed. The problem is that the two men that robbed the store that they were accused of robbing and had killed the clerk, they were Italian. And so they found these two Italian men. The gun matched the gun used in the murder, and they used them and charged them with murder. The problem here is that after they were charged with killing the paymaster in Massachusetts, the case against them was weak and suffused with nativist prejudice and fears. But because both men were confessed anarchists, they faced a widespread public presumption of guilt. So Seiko and Vanzetti kind of become the face of this scare, if you want to call it that, or this fear of immigrants in general. And over the next several years, public support for them grows. But on August 23rd, 1927, amid widespread protest in the United States, Seiko and Vanzetti still proclaimed their innocence, died in the electric chair. And so they were unfortunately murdered. Now, in the election of 1920, we're going to see this push for normalcy, okay? And it's important to note that Woodrow Wilson leaves office in a very vulnerable state, okay? And our country's at a point now where really things are beginning to change, all right? You've got race riots, we just came off of a war, we're really trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen in the country over the course of the next 10 years. And guys, I can tell you that the most important change in our history is coming. Specifically as a nation, the next 30 years of history is monumental to civil rights, to economic changes, to the way things are in today's society. But that's going to be left in the hands of Warren G. Harding, and he's going to become our new president, and he's going to be left with the task of building America through the roaring 20s. And we'll continue that more going forward. So, know that was a really long lecture, accounting part 1, but it's also a very, very loaded chapter in terms of information and things that we need to talk about. So, please make sure you're listening to all the lectures, keeping up with your vocabulary and all the things from the text. If you need any help, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.